good to give our team a round of applause, isn't it? They work so hard. They really do. They come through the week and practice as well. So it does take up a lot of time. We'll talk about that this morning too, about being generous with our time as well. So that's good. I'll encourage you just quickly where you are, sitting for a little while. You don't have to get up, but do you want to just turn to the person, whether it's next to you or behind you, and just say, I'm glad you're in church this morning. I'll give you a minute to do that. I'm glad you're here. Minutes up. Oh, I know. I shouldn't count, should I? All the time in the world to love each other. It's funny, we once, I think Matt shared it with me once. He said he heard a preacher say that sometimes bringing the word of God feels like this heavy burden on your heart that you need to share. And you have like this weight that you feel until you release it. And it's funny, I actually feel a bit of that this morning, which I'm praying is a good thing. I'm praying that God's going to bless that, and my words will be his words, so that when I've released this word, that burden won't be there any longer. So that's exciting. So we started last week a 4-week series on generosity. And it's based on a series called A Generous Life. I think Matt shared last week by Church of the Highlands. They did a 4-week series. And so we're doing that also here at NRC. So last week, we had a look at the motivation of a generous life. What motivates us? The state of our heart. What does our heart look like? And how do we live a generous life? Why are we generous? And Matt spoke about giving joyfully, selflessly, willingly, thankfully, and intentionally. So today, week 2, we're going to have a look at the marks of a generous life and the benefits of a generous life. So I don't know if you think of a mark, if something is marked, my first thought goes to times when my children have drawn on things, whether it's walls or tables, whatever it is. So when something's marked, it's visible, isn't it? It's noticeable. You can see it. Are our lives noticeably generous? Are people seeing the generosity of God through the way that we live our lives and the way that we're living? And I want to encourage you now just to think to yourself, when you think of someone you know who's lived a generous life, is there someone that comes to mind? It might be someone who you know is quite generous with their finances. It could be someone that you know who's generous with their time, or someone that just oozes generosity, whatever that looks like. And when I thought of this, someone that came to mind for me was my mother. You see, she was an officer, had 4 young kids, didn't have a lot of money, but with whatever she had, she was always generous. And I think more so probably in her time. She was often minding children and helping people out practically, not just financially, but she was a very generous woman, and she still is to this day. And she has this line that she often says to me. She goes, Amanda, my riches are in heaven. And it's often too when she's shouting at grandchildren things, in the back of my mind I go, Mum, you've got a holiday next month. You shouldn't be buying this. And her line is, Amanda, my riches are in heaven. And I know they will be for her. They will be. And Jesus teaches us in the Gospel of Luke how to live a generous life. And we're going to have a look at that this morning, and Kata read that for us. So Mitch is going to pop that on the screen for us. So have a look together. And happy birthday to Mitch today. It's Mitch's birthday. Talk about being generous with your time too, or our sound guys. So it's Luke chapter 10, we're going to have a look together, and I'll read it. I'll read it again. Luke 10 verses 30 to 37. In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road. When he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he travelled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him, bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him into the inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbour to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. It's a good word, isn't it? I love it. The marks of a generous life. This man, this Samaritan we see, he had the marks of a generous life all over him, didn't he? And in verse 33, we get the first insight to what a generous life looks like. The word pity is actually translated, which I didn't realise, but it's got a translation of the word compassion. So the heart of a generous life starts with love. That's the first point this morning. A love that looks beyond itself. Colossians 3 verse 12 says, therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourself with compassion. The love of God, God's compassion, should be compelling us. It should be compelling us, just like the Samaritan, not to walk past that man that was there. If we see a need, we should be compelled by love to stop and to look beyond ourselves and meet that need. True generosity comes from the heart. It's a heart attitude, a generous demonstration of God's love, enriching someone else's life. The second mark of a generous life is willing to invest time in others. Ecclesiastes 3 verse 17, God will bring to judgment both the righteous and the wicked, for there will be a time for every activity, a time for every deed. For some of us, maybe the challenge is that we're being more greedy with our time than we are with our money. One thing I love about living in Maxwell, so we came from Sydney, and whenever I walk through town or in the shops and I see somebody, I feel like people actually stop and give you the time to spend time to chat to you, and you feel like no one's in a rush, or whether they are, they don't let you know that. And they just give you the time and they say hello to you, and I just love that. I found that so refreshing about this town. And I remember times in Sydney where I'd be in the shops or going somewhere and you'd see somebody and people that you know and you stop to talk to them. And even if they tried, and some people really did, but even if they tried to give you the time, you could see it. It was almost like it was written on their foreheads. I have somewhere to do, somewhere to be. I've got a minute, quick. But we are often in a rush, aren't we? And lives are busy. Life is hard. But this man, so we don't actually know in Scripture where he was going that day. But I can guarantee you that he probably was going somewhere. It would be highly unlikely that he wasn't on his way to something. But he stopped. Verse 34 said he stopped and he went to this man who was in need. We've got to invest time. If we want to see transformation happen in people's lives, we've got to invest time. And this isn't so much a story about transformation that I'm going to share, but I remember when I just had Maisie, so it was about 4 years ago, and we had 2 friends at our church at the same time that had also had children. They were about to go back to maternity leave after a year, and I just commenced my maternity leave with Maisie. And I remember them talking to me about how hard it is to go back to work part-time because you've got to pay for childcare. And so it's almost counterproductive to go back to work a few days because by the time you pay for these kids to be minded, you don't really come ahead. And they were really struggling. There's 2 friends. And I remember saying to Matt, I wish we were in a position where I could just offer to pay a day for these kids to go to childcare, just to help these families financially. And we weren't in a position to do that. And so I offered for that year that I had time with Maisie. I minded these 2 kids one day a week. And it was hectic. It was hectic having 3 babies at home. But God blessed that, and I would have loved to have given financially, but I wasn't able to. So I offered my time and had these extra little people for that 1 day a week. So we need to be able to, where we can, give time and invest that into others' lives. That's a mark of generosity. Number 3, willing to use its abilities and resources at hand. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 10. Each should use whatever gift he has received to serve others, faithfully administering God's grace in its various forms. Verse 33 of this chapter. He took care of him through that whole night. And often we say to ourselves, I could be more generous if I had more. Or this stage in my life, it's too hard. I need to wait until things are a little bit easier to be generous. And that's normal to feel that way. It really is. But we need to be able to give from a place where we already are. Generosity flows from where we are right now. And God's not going to ask you to give away something that you don't already have. And this story, it's an amazing story. I read it this week and I can't wait to share it. I'm going to try and get through it in one piece. But it's a story about a young girl. She was 13 and she was asked to go to an underprivileged kids camp in the States. 13-year-old. She was too young to be an official staff member. So she went along to help at this camp. And there was a younger girl, one of the underprivileged kids that was attending this camp, and came up to her. And really dirty. Her feet were covered in dirt and she was wearing thongs or flip-flops, jandals, whatever you call them. And her feet were filthy and one of them was broken. And she came up to this 13-year-old and she said, do you have tape? Can you tape my thong back together? And this 13-year-old's response was, she said, I don't have tape. And she said, hang on a minute. And she goes into her room, goes into a bag, and she comes back with a pair of these. I've got a picture. All right, Chuck Taylor's Converse All-Star shoes, not cheap. And they were this 13-year-old's shoes. And what this girl did was she went to this kid and she washed her feet. Her feet were dirty from these thongs. She grabbed a pair of socks. She put them on the little girl's feet and she put these shoes on her. And she said, you see that on the back where the star, it says All-Star? You are God's All-Star. And when he looks at you, you are an all-star in his eyes. The best part about this story is that this 13-year-old went back to her town in Belgrade in the States. And between her and her friends, they have started up this organisation. And they just do little things like lemonade stalls, baking. And they fund this organisation. It's on a website. It's All Stars for Belgrade. And it's a town in the States. And this little girl's goal is that every child wears a pair of All-Star Converse shoes. Not to have this designer label, but so that they all know that they are all-stars in God's sight. It's a good story, isn't it? But don't wait until you've got everything you need. God can use you and your resources now. Look what he did through that 13-year-old with a pair of shoes. Number 4, and the 4th mark of a generous life, is intentionally giving money for eternal purposes. Romans 12, verses 13. Share with God's people who are in need. Verse 35, the Samaritan gave his time. He gave his time, his resources, his talents, and now he gave his money financially. And this man reflects not only the love of God, but the generous heart of God and who he is. His life had the marks of a generous heart and a generous life. And Billy Graham says this, if you get the giving aspect right, everything else in your spiritual walk will fall into place. Our giving marks our heart's priority. We're going to have a look at the second part of the message today. We looked at the marks of a generous life, and we're going to have a look at the benefits of a generous life. And I want to read to you 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 6 to 12, and they'll come up on the screen as well. So this is talking about the benefits of a generous life. Remember this, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. As it is written, they have freely scattered their gifts to the poor, their righteousness endures forever. Now he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will also supply and increase your store of seed and will enlarge the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in every way so that you can be generous on every occasion. And through us, your generosity will result in thanksgiving to God. This service that you perform is not only supplying the needs of the Lord's people, but is also overflowing in many expressions of thanks to God. Another great chapter, isn't it? The benefits of the generous life. The first one, the favour of God. Psalm 112 verse 5, good will come to him who is generous. I want to encourage you to do something for me. Can you hold two fists like this? Yeah. So we know, don't we? We hold on to things tightly in this world, in our life. It's hard to be generous, isn't it? You can't give if your fists are closed. But I want to encourage you to open them. And a generous life looks like this, doesn't it? A generous life looks like holding loosely onto things, holding loosely so that we can be ready to freely give when that time arises. But what I love about this too, and Reese, but I think she's gone out to kids' church, she portrayed this beautifully in that kids' time. And we must encourage her because it was perfect. But the good thing is about when we holding on loosely, our hands are already open, which means that we're also ready to freely receive. See, God, his favour, he will bless you, and he will bless you tenfold. And we don't give to get, we give to give. That's the intention of our hearts. But God, who's a God of favour, undeserved favour on our part, when our hands are open and we're holding on loosely to things, we're also ready to freely receive. And the second benefit of a generous life is this, real prosperity. Proverbs 11:23, a generous man will prosper. He who refreshes others will himself be refreshed. And we're talking about true prosperity here. Prosperity of the soul, of your relationships, prosperity of your family. True prosperity that money can't buy. Have you ever seen that MasterCard ad where they talk about something, they say, oh, this cost this amount of money, this cost this amount of money, but this was priceless. But for everything else, there's MasterCard. Have you seen that ad? Yeah. It's a bit like this. True prosperity that money can't buy. Priceless prosperity. And the third benefit of a generous life is a legacy of impact. Psalm 37, verses 25 to 26. I have never seen the righteous forsaken or their children begging for bread. They are always generous and their children will be blessed. This impact of a generous life will be for generations to come. I shared before about my mum, and I kind of didn't tell you the full story because I wanted to wait for this moment. And she is generous. She's a very generous woman. But there's someone I know who's more generous than her. And that's my grandmother. And that's my mum's mother. There wasn't a Sunday lunch that we went to growing up where there wasn't someone across the table that we didn't know, we hadn't seen before. Or someone she brought home from church because I had nowhere else to go for lunch. But you see, Mum learnt that generous life from somewhere. And that's an impact, that generous life, her legacy lives on. And I pray that it will continue to live on for those generations. Generosity has a legacy of impact. Whether we see it here on earth or not, it does. And the fifth benefit of a generous life is a bonus. And the bonus is that we store up treasures in heaven. 1 Timothy 6, verses 18 to 19. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up treasures. This week, Matt and I were at a training event and actually spoke on the treasures in heaven. And it's amazing how God links everything in. But this is a bonus for us, isn't it? That by living a generous life, we're storing up those treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, thieves cannot break in and steal. Treasures in heaven, because where your treasure is, there your heart is also. So the bottom line this morning is this. Our generosity is a reflection of the generosity of God. We help reveal the heart of God to others when we live a generous life. 2 Corinthians 5:20, Paul says this, "We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us." As Christ's ambassadors, we're called to live a generous life, and it will have an impact for eternity. I'm going to invite the team to come up. We're going to sing this song together, and we're going to pray after. But I just want to encourage you for this time, as you worship and spend time in the presence of God, just to ask God, say, God, where is it that you're needing me to be more generous? And I can guarantee you he'll tell you, whether it's you're being challenged to be more generous with your time or your giving or whatever that looks like for you today. I want to encourage you to spend this time asking God what he's asking of you.